Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to show you how to make a small child's quilt. It measures approximately 43 inches long and 35 inches wide. I use 8-inch squares and it has a small border, but if you wanted to make it a bit bigger you could add an extra border. Right, so let's get started. To make this quilt I used 5 fat quarters and I cut 4 8-inch squares out of each of the fat quarters, giving me 20 8 by 8 inch squares. I then arranged these squares in 4 columns and 5 rows, trying to make sure that I didn't have any of the same squares next to each other. When I was happy with the order, I took all of column 2 rows and placed each one on top of column 1 rows. Then I placed all of column 4 pieces on top of the column 3 pieces. Then I took the bottom 2 squares and placed them on the next row, and then lifted those up and placed them on the next row, and continued till I had them all in a pile in the right order. And I put a label on saying either column 1 or 2 or columns 3 and 4. Now the next job is to sew the pairs together, and in order to keep my 1/4 inch seam allowance on these, I drew with a pencil my 1/4 inch seam down each side. It also made sure that I sewed down exactly the right side and didn't get the wrong side. So on the right hand side of each of my pairs I drew a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then pinned all the pairs together of columns 1 and 2. Then sew all of the first 2 columns together, taking your 1/4 inch seam allowance. These can be chain pieced together, so as soon as you finish sewing your first, do a couple of extra stitches but leave it attached, lift up your presser foot, add your next piece, and then just carry on sewing from the end of the next piece all the way to the other end, and again do a couple of stitches past the end and then add your next piece and continue sewing. It just saves a lot of stopping and starting, and also saves on your thread. You don't have to keep cutting off your threads. You just carry on sewing until they're all sewn, and of course with it being quilting you don't need to back tack at the end of each piece. You just go straight on to the next piece. Then using a small pair of scissors or a pair of snips, separate your pairs. Then repeat with columns 3 and 4. So sew all of the pairs together from columns 3 and 4, and then separate the pairs using a pair of small scissors or a pair of snips. And the next job is to join the rows together. So from the columns we're going to make rows now. So we're going to join the first pairs of squares from columns 1 and 2 to columns 3 and 4. For this step it's useful to use the photograph you took in the beginning to make sure you do get the right pairs together. But if you've kept them in the right order you should be fine. So take the first 2 squares from each of the columns and join them together. So join at the centre here, put a couple of pins in or clips to hold them together. Then if you're worried about sticking to your 1/4 inch seam allowance, you can do as I did before and draw your 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you're confident to do this, then don't worry about this next step. Go ahead and pin all of your pairs together to form your rows, referring to your original photograph if you need to, and mark your 1/4 inch seam allowance if you feel you need to. Then sew your pieces together, again taking your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and again you can chain piece if you wish to. Then disconnect your rows using a pair of snips or a small pair of scissors. Press your seams so that the first row the seams are going to the left, and then the next row the seams will go to right, and carry on until you have all of your seams on the first row going in one direction, all of the seams in the next row going in the opposite direction, and then keep going from left to right until you have pressed all of your rows. When you've pressed all of your rows you can begin to join them, and as we pressed one side in one direction, or at least one row in one direction and the next row in the opposite direction, they should fit together nicely. as you see here. When you've married the seams up nicely and they're sandwiched together nicely, put a pin in each of the seams first, and then you can pin the rest of the row together. You can either sew one at a time or pin them all together and sew them all together at the machine. It's entirely up to you. Then if you like, you can mark your 1/4 inch seam allowance, or if you don't need to, then don't bother. Then at your sewing machine, sew your rows together, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, removing any pins as you go along. I like to leave the pins where the join is till the last possible minute, holding it in place, and then I take them out just before I cross the join, and continue to sew all the way along to the end of the row. Then continue to pin and sew all of your rows together in this way, making sure that your seams are matched well and that you have one seam going to the right, the other going to the left as you join the rows. And again, if you want to, you can draw a pencil line on to keep your 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you've attached all of your rows, it's time to press the seams. So first we need to set the seams, and to do this we just press on the closed seam and then press all of the row seams in one direction. I'm pressing mine up towards the top. That's the top piece there, and I'm pressing towards the top. So I'll press towards the top on all of the seams. The next job is to add a border if you want one. So I'm just measuring the width to begin with. I measure the top and the bottom of the quilt to make sure that they're both the same, and luckily they are both 31 inches. For this size of quilt, I needed to cut 4 strips 3.5 inches wide for all of the borders. I didn't need to join any at all, just cut 4 strips 3.5 inches wide. The width of my quilt was 31 inches at each end, so I cut 2 of the strips down to the 31 inches so they fit exactly, and I pinned one to the top and one to the bottom with right sides facing. Then at the sewing machine, sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and do the same for both of the ends. Now that we have both of our ends attached, we can measure up for the sides. Obviously we need to include the border that we've just attached, so we're going to measure from the top of one border to the bottom of the other border on both sides, just to check they're both the same. And this time both sides measured 42.5 inches. So I just really needed to cut the selvages off the pieces of fabric that I'd already cut, and it was the right length. Next, fold your side of your quilt in half to find the centre, and do exactly the same with the border, and place the border on top of the quilt with right sides facing and lining up the 2 centre marks that you made, and then pin or clip in place, and do the same on both sides. Then at your sewing machine, join both borders to the sides, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, removing your pins and clips as you go along, and repeat on the second side, and then press all of the seams to one side. That's part 1 completed. Now we need to make our quilt sandwich. So cut a piece of backing fabric and a piece of batting 4 inches longer and 4 inches wider than your quilt. Then stretch the backing fabric out on a large table with the right side facing down. And I've used a bit of decorator's tape to secure the corners down, and then I'm putting my batting over the top. Then put your quilt over the batting with the right side facing up, and you should have 2 inches of batting and backing fabric spare around the edge, and that's fine, that's just how it should be. Flatten the quilt the best you can, making sure there's no creases in it. When you're satisfied that your quilt sandwich is nice and level and there are no creases, you can start to put pins in each square. I have special quilters safety pins, and they're probably the best thing to, well, in my opinion, the best thing to use. I just put one of these into each square to hold all the pieces together while I'm quilting. You could tack your pieces together, it's up to you, or you could use normal pins, but I find that a little bit dangerous. It's much better to use safety pins if you can. Anyway, put a pin in each of your squares. For this quilt, I'm just doing straight diagonal lines. And there are, well, probably several ways to do this, but I'm going to show you two ways. The first is to use painter's tape to mark the lines, and then you sew next to the painter's tape. So use your quilter's ruler to guide you and put your tape in nice straight lines. I did eventually go back and do, I think these are 4 inch apart, these lines, but I did do them 2 inches apart. To do the quilting, I use a walking foot, and on this quilt I'm using blue thread for the bottom and the top. The idea is with the tape that you sew just to the side of it. Try not to sew into the tape, otherwise it's really difficult to take off and it will get tangled up in your stitches and it's really quite difficult. So try your best not to sew into the tape, if at all possible. And another easy method is to draw your lines. So I use a friction pen. These are pens that you can draw on your fabric and then iron them and the marks disappear. However, the marks will reappear if your quilt gets very cold. So it's probably not the best idea if you live in a cold country, or at least colder than the UK. After originally deciding to do my lines 4 inches apart, I changed my mind and I'm now doing them 2 inches apart. When you've drawn all of your lines, you can start to quilt. Again, you need your walking foot if possible, and again I've got blue thread. And this time you're going to follow directly on top of the lines. So you're sewing on top of the lines that you've just drawn. Continue to sew down all of your lines until you finish the whole quilt. Next, you need to trim your batting and your backing fabric to match your quilt size. So to do this, I'm using my longest quilter's ruler I've got and a rotary cutter. I've already trimmed one side, so now I'm going to use this edge to get a right angle for the next side. So I line up the bottom edge of the quilt with the ruler and the side, and then I'm going to cut a nice straight square line and continue cutting and turning until you've trimmed off all 4 sides of your quilt. The next job is to add the binding. Now I have already cut my binding at 2.5 inches and I've joined it so I have a long enough length to go all the way around this quilt, and then I either clip or pin in place. Starting at the centre of your quilt, the centre of the longest side I usually start at, and give yourself a good tail end. Start pinning or clipping your binding tape to your quilt and go all the way to the first corner with your clipping or pinning and then stop. Then with a friction pen make a mark on your quilt and your binding 1/4 inch away from the edge, and this is the mark we're going to sew up to. So at your sewing machine, sew taking 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way along this first side to the mark that we left. When you get to the mark, you can either back tack as I'm doing here, or if you don't want to do that, you can stop at the mark with your needle down and then sew off to the corner. The choice is yours. I do either or. Then fold your binding tape at a 45-degree angle and match the side of the quilt up with the edge of the binding, and then fold the binding back over itself, keeping it level with the top edge. Then pin or clip in place, or you could just put it straight in your sewing machine and sew straight away. And then start sewing from the top corner again, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down to the next corner where we'll do exactly the same thing. Keep sewing all the way around the edge of your quilt until you're back to about 12 inches from where you started. We need to leave a good gap to join the 2 pieces of binding together. I first put a mark on my right hand side of the binding, roughly about the centre of the opening. I then draw a straight line and cut. Then fold the left hand side over and make a mark where it joins the right side. So make a mark where you've just cut the left side off, but on the right hand side. Then from this mark add the width of your binding, in this case 2.5 inches plus 1/4 inch for seam allowance. Put a mark and then cut. Then take the left hand side piece, open it out and place it right side up. Then take the right hand side piece and place it on top of the left hand piece at right angles. It's a little bit tight here, so I'm going to put a pin in it just to keep it all together, and then we're going to draw a 45-degree angle across where we're going to join it. So starting at the top left hand side, draw a 45-degree angle and put a pin in it, or a couple of pins. Then at your sewing machine, sew across the line that you have just drawn. I usually back tack at the start and the finish of this, just to make sure it doesn't come undone. And then cut the excess fabric off and give a quick press with a hot iron, and either pin or clip your binding in place, and it's ready to sew the opening closed. So sew taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next you can fold over your binding, so fold it over to the wrong side, and I like to clip in place, or if you prefer you can pin in place. When you get to the corners, continue folding it down all the way to the end and then fold the other side over, as you see here, and you should end up with a nice mitered corner. Carry on folding your binding over all the way round, making sure that when you fold it over it just passes your original seam when you attach the binding, so about 1/8 inch past the original seam. When you've turned all the binding over, the next job is to stitch it down. Now I like to hand stitch. I know it's time consuming, but I find it gets the best results. So I thread my needle and I start sewing just under where you folded over the binding, so you can't see your knot. So take a stitch just under, and then we're going to take a bite of fabric from the binding, going in a parallel line, and where we come out we go back in, only this time we're going to go into the quilt, and again we're going to take a parallel line about 1/8 inch of the fabric and pull the thread, and continue in this way until you've got all the way around your quilt. And when you get back to where you started from, that's your quilt finished. Well done. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, could you please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.